Welcome to Cultivated Live for Friday, May 17th, 2024. I'm Jade Rosenthal, co-founder of Cultivated Media and host of Cultivated Live. Since we launched Cultivated way back in November, our goal has been to be cannabis industry first, providing you with the most important, insightful, useful, and timely information. We do that in two key ways. One, through our daily newsletter, Cultivated Daily. We do that through this daily live stream at Cultivated Live. We would love if you followed us on LinkedIn, subscribe to our really successful YouTube channel, but most importantly, get our daily newsletter in your inbox every single morning. A link to how to do that and all those things is below. In a moment, we're going to have Krista Raymer come on for our weekly touch base with her on all things cannabis retail. We're going to be talking about basket drivers versus impulse purchases. She's going to have to define those two things for me first and what that means for inventory for cannabis retailers. But first, let's get to the news. And as if you didn't already hear, here's what's driving the cannabis news today. This one first is brought to you by the White House.
This is monumental. Today, my administration took a major step to reclassify marijuana from a Schedule I drug to a Schedule III drug. It's an important move toward reversing long-standing inequities. Today's announcement builds on the work we've already done to pardon a record number of federal offenses for simple possession of marijuana. And it adds to the action we've taken to lift barriers to housing, employment, small business loans, and so much more for tens of thousands of Americans. Look, folks, no one should be in jail merely for using or possessing marijuana, period. Far too many lives have been upended because of failed approach to marijuana, and I'm committed to righting those wrongs. You have my word on it.
I just like when the president says, look, folks. So you saw what President Biden was talking about, of course, but that wasn't all, because the White House was not done talking, but also what actually happened. So yesterday, the Justice Department posted a notice of proposed rulemaking that makes the long push to federal reclassify cannabis as a less dangerous drug official. So the rule would move cannabis from the most restrictive Schedule I of the Controlled Substances Act to the far less restrictive Schedule III, which has massive ramifications for cannabis businesses, cannabis consumers, cannabis researchers and doctors, and policymakers alike. It certainly stops well short of federal legalization or even decriminalization. But there's still a lot of unknowns about the timing, but the official policy or the rulemaking kicked off this week, and there's a 60-day comment period, which we will no doubt talk about in the coming days and weeks and 2 months. But they weren't done. So the Vice President Kamala Harris also made a video. The press secretary for the White House discussed how rescheduling would remove barriers for research, among other benefits, during a press conference. For his part, Ed Conklin, the director of the U.S. Cannabis Council and industry trade group, obviously said, our ultimate goal is federal legalization, and we will see Schedule III as a necessary and critical step along the way. We will submit comments in the coming days in support of the proposed rule. And if you want to read the 92-page document, you can get it on our website at cultivated.news in today's newsletter. It is there. So print it out, download it, read it this weekend. That is really the major news driving the industry today. So I want to bring up Krista Raymer without further delay to talk cannabis retail inventory strategy. Krista, I'm coming right to you. Krista, usually you join us on Thursday, but yesterday we had the CEO of MariMed, and I don't like to bump you for anybody, but he's from Massachusetts, and they sell my favorite edibles, which are Betty's Eddies. So I thought I'd have to bump you for him, but you're with us on Friday, so welcome.
You just trade me in for somebody else from Massachusetts. That's where we're at these days.
I wouldn't generally do that, but they do make Betty's Eddies, and that I would trade you for. Not you, but trade the slot. You're here today.
Okay, great.
Thank you for making time. If there were Krista's edibles, I might not do that, but you don't make edibles yet, and they do. They also make something called Bubby's Brownies, which is what we call our grandmothers in Yiddish, which I didn't actually know, but I do like Bubby's Brownies, which is also what we call the brownies that my mother-in-law drops off. So if we lived in Massachusetts, we'd have to be very careful with what we call Bubby's Brownies.
Okay. That is a nomenclature problem.
That is, I don't think it's a problem. I think that was very intentional from John Levine and the company in Massachusetts. Okay. I love talking about two things that I reference every retail conversation with. One is play it against sports. Yes. And I go in, we want to buy skates, and we end up with skates, tape, laces, and sometimes stick wax, which if you don't play hockey, you don't know. So that's like one thing. I want you to break down that for me because I know it comes up in cannabis. The other is like Marshalls or Winners here, where you go in for whatever you're going to buy, and then you're in the lineup, which they very intentionally put you in, and you end up buying chips, a charger, and gum, usually, is what we end up buying. Like, break down that for me because I feel like in dispensaries it's sometimes difficult, but give me that because I know I've done a little bit of watching of your like master classes. Break down that experience for me and what dispensary owners, operators, and bud tenders can learn from that.
Yeah, I think one of the things when we look at cannabis transactions or interactions with customers is that there's usually something that is the basket driver and something that is impulse driven. So you've just identified those within those physical spaces. What is the thing that has caused the customer to go to the store or to go to the website, for example? And then what is the product that the customer didn't anticipate to purchase but ends up adding to their basket? So when we look at UPT rates or units per transaction across different states and provinces, on average, the cannabis industry is sitting somewhere between kind of like 1.7 and 3, depending on the market. I will caveat that to say that there's like some product price that interacts with that data. So the lower the product price, the more units per transaction, the higher the product price, the less units per transaction. And so within a transaction, we can identify and say, what's the driver versus what is impulse? And the important part of this is to actually look at the assortment and say, do I have the right product to fulfill those different dynamics that are happening in the store? And does our bud tending team are they able to identify what?
Hold on.
That is because
Stop. For like a second, your sound went out. So you said like the important part is to be able to something.
Okay, so you want me to start just like the important part?
Yes.
Okay. I don't remember.
I know. I can't rewind it, but just
let me go back. Let me just go back. Okay.
Go back. Yeah.
So within an assortment, it's really important to be able to distinguish what's the difference between the driver and the impulse product. And because that's going to influence how and what the customer purchases, how and what the bud tender sells to the customer as well. And the thing that we see is that these categories have a mix of drivers and impulse products all within one category. So let's use flour as the example. Flour has ounces and also has eighths. Two very different customer behaviors. Ounces have a tendency to be the driver, so the reason the customer is purchasing, and eighths have a tendency to be either the driver or an impulse product, depending on what the transaction looks like. And so if you keep those grouped into one category, it's really misleading in the data to know exactly what's going on.
Yeah, because if I come in for an ounce and you want to, I'm looking down at my notes of what you just said. My impulse could be an eighth. Whereas if I come in for an eighth, my impulse could be a lighter, a rolling paper or something. Like it could be a lot of different things.
Yep.
With how you think about that. And then I think you're thinking like back of house, how do you analyze what's moving, which one is which? And then you have to actually unpack every single transaction to understand how we're doing.
Yeah, what we're talking about is actually like the outputs of the inputs. And what I mean by that is like how it shows up in the transaction is an outcome of what was available to sell in the first place. And so the first step is like, if you want to change UPT or if you want to make sure that you have the right basket drivers or the right impulse products, we actually have to go back to assortment and say, do I have the right products in the store at the right time? And most of the time when we've looked at inventory specifically, ounces are underserviced. They're expensive to purchase, so I can understand why a retailer, like from a wholesale perspective, might be hesitant to invest in them. But typically those products are underserviced compared to eighths, and we're almost over-indexed in something like eighths in most markets. And so being able to see that in the data outside of just flour is important, because if we look at flour as a big chunky category, it might say, yeah, we have enough units on hand to support the sales. But if you really dig in and break it out into subcategories, however makes sense to organize it for your store, we can usually see that some product is selling out, other product is overstocked. And so the mix in between is that you're properly stocked, but in reality, you're missing opportunities or are burning cash by having inventory age.
Because you don't want so let me, like an idiot, like you don't want someone coming in and their actual basket driver's not there for sure.
Right.
But similarly, you don't want all the basket drivers might be higher dollar value and no impulse available purchases, because then you're missing out on units per transaction per se. And then you got to intersperse sort of the price of all those things, because that's how people actually shop. It's
Right.
I think it's like a big grid, and you got to look at it. Is that how you actually analyze inventory, like on a grid, and then a sales success? Like,
Yeah, that's one of the ways that you can take a look. So one of the things that we want to take a look at is velocity per unit. A lot of the time retailers will take a look at velocity in relation to margin as well and say, what does that look like on an axis of velocity and on an axis of margin? High margin, high velocity is like the dream, but is that really where most things sit? And so it's plotting that accordingly. And also, if you put all of those data points onto one thing, are they in reference to each other? Right. So if I plot all of my inventory, like flower and pre-rolls on the same plot, it's going to tell us really different things, because the sensitivity, or what is the driver versus what is the impulse product, don't align. And this is why getting into categories and subdividing into like for like product is the most important to identify where you have gaps in assortment.
Yeah. I'm getting it. I'm finally getting it. We've been talking all these years, we're getting it. But then adding to another component of it, and this is like, I think someone on your team posted this, like what time horizons we're looking at, and I think you've talked about it here too, is also important, because you look at it month over month. February kind of sucks because it doesn't have enough days. Sometimes it doesn't even have the same amount of weekends, but then some months have 5 weekends, which definitely skews the data. So how do you look at all those things you just talked about and plot them even on a time horizon that is like for like? And is it a certain number of weeks, and not necessarily correlated to months, but is it like every 4 weeks, every 4 full weeks, or every 5 weekends, whatever those chunks of time are? Now we're adding like another layer to this graph, and it's like 3-dimensional chess.
And now I'm going to layer in seasonality and say, how does the customer shift and change over the year? And so as we're about to go into Victoria Day or Memorial Day in Canada and in the US, we usually see an uptick in things like pre-rolls. And it's not necessarily pre-roll packs. A lot of the time it's like single pre-rolls, but do you have the right assortment to facilitate that? And so that is part of what makes inventory complicated, is you can set inventory that might be working today, but in the middle of September, you need different things. And so it's an iterative process.
Can I ask you a question about that? So now we're getting to like obviously operations of a dispensary, or even a number of dispensaries. In the least advanced or the most advanced dispensary teams, whether it's a one shop or 100, if it wasn't cannabis, how many people would be working on inventory full time, like analyzing the data we just talked about? Like if it was Marshalls, or like what would they would have a massive team thinking about this only. In cannabis, how many people have a full-time team thinking about this?
I think once you get to a certain volume, it makes sense to have a team looking at this full time. Even within this, there are different roles that function. So there would be a role that is like somebody picking what the product that gets purchased is, like an inventory buyer. There's also an inventory planner, and that's the person that's taking a look and forecasting how much inventory in each category, subcategory you need, what are the dollars that we're going to need to invest, and then giving that feedback to the buyer to then have like constraint and control around what is getting brought in. So a buyer is almost like a curator. A planner is like somebody who's allocating financial resources. Now, there is on the other back end of that, then there can also be an inventory analyst who might be looking at things like pricing strategies. And so the combination of all of these roles work together to make sure that you have the right product in the store at the right time.
It's complicated, Krista.
It is, but it isn't, in that
I mean that in the most positive way, like it's complicated, and if you do it right, you will reap the rewards.
Yeah, and this is like often when we get into more mature markets, it's about refinement at this point. And so what does the number of customers look like in your customer base, and like how do we refine how we sell to them? So where can you gain margin along the way, or profit dollars along the way? And so this is what we're talking about, is a game of saying, can I see the information that I need to activate on clearly? And most of the time we can't if we keep the categories too big. So category, subcategory, to be able to see what we need to look at, to be able to solve for.
Every time we talk, I learn something new. And then I told you it impacts how I shop and think about my in-store experience and what I buy, both in-store and online. And I super appreciate it. We're heading into a long weekend here in Canada. It is Victoria Day. If you're interested in Victoria Day in Canada, I don't know, look it up. I don't actually know, but I do know that we do call it here May 24, which is great because that's how many beers are in a case of beer for those non-Canadians that want to know why we call it May 24, which is just an awesome.
It's like a summer kickoff.
It's awesome. It's a summer kickoff, much like Memorial Day, but they don't call Memorial Day May 24 like we call Victoria May 24. But thank you, Krista. This impacts how I think about shopping, what I'm going to buy, whether I know it or not. So thank you so much. Have a good long weekend, and we will see you next week, but back on your regular day on Thursday.
Great. See you next week.
Thanks, Krista. Thank you, Krista, as always. That is it for today's Cultivated Live. We encourage you to subscribe to our daily newsletter at cultivated.news. I think I did that right. Or follow us on LinkedIn and slash the subscribe button on YouTube if you're watching there. We will not be back on Monday. It is a holiday where I live here in Canada. So we'll be back Tuesday, 10 a.m. Eastern, right here on LinkedIn and YouTube, or YouTube, depending if you want to watch one feed or two. But remember, because it's the weekend, because it's a long weekend here in Canada, buy cannabis at your local dispensary. Thanks, everybody. Have a good and safe weekend.